now that a good amount of, I think, people have started to make their way down to um, this panel, let's go ahead and start. I'm going to begin by introducing Dr. Zarina Graywal. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Graywal, for doing this. We've been really excited to hear from you and to kind of incorporate you into the broader discussion that's happening over the course of this weekend. For those of you who are just now entering the panel, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Graywal. Dr. Graywal is a historical anthropologist and a documentary filmmaker whose research focuses on race, gender, religion, nationalism, and transnationalism across a wide spectrum of American Muslim communities. Her first book, Islam is a Foreign Country, American Muslims and the Global Crisis of Authority, published by NYU 2013, is an ethnography of transnational Muslim networks that link US mosques to Islamic movements in the post-colonial Middle East through debates about the reform of Islam. And with that, Dr. Graywal, please feel free to begin.
Thank you so much, Arpan, and also to Kylie and Emma for inviting me and for making every part of this so smooth and wonderful. What wonderful program! I have to say I'm really honored to be with you, but also disappointed for us to not be there together. And I really do appreciate everyone who has showed up today. I am zooming in from my home in New Haven, Connecticut, which is on the lands of the Quinnipiac people, and that is where I live and work. And I think for all of us, we are struggling every day, and so to even put in the time to come and listen is something that I know is not easy to do, and I really appreciate everyone who's here and everyone who worked to organize this. I also have to say that I came to this conference in its second iteration 17 years ago in 2004 as a graduate student myself, and I workshopped what was then a very rough dissertation chapter that became a chapter in my book, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. And since we're just coming off the wonderful artist panel, I also have to say I showed my documentary film By the Dawn's Early Light about Muhammad Abdul Rauf at this conference in 2004 as well. And I made friends and got wonderful feedback, and many of those friends became colleagues that I treasure and consider friends to this day. So I just it means something special for me to be here with you today and to talk about my work and some of the things that we're all grappling with as we think about the study of race and Islam and together. So I want to begin by taking us back a couple of years to this viral photo of Lakota scholar activist Nick Estes and Navajo scholar activist Melanie Yazzie, who, in response to the executive order known as the Muslim ban, started the hashtag No Ban on Stolen Land as part of the nationwide protests at airports. Estes told the CBC people were seeing things like "This land is your land" or the Star Spangled Banner, and it was a very jarring experience for a lot of Native folks that were there. It didn't accurately tell the history of exclusion and banning people and whose lands it actually belongs to. And explaining why he joined the protest and took in Muslim refugee families from Syria to an indigenous welcoming ceremony, he said, "It's not that we have to say we're pro-immigration for people to come and steal our lands. It means that if people are going to come here and coexist peacefully, it has to be on the terms of the people whose land it is to begin with. We recognize the Muslim refugees' humanity in distinction to the United States, which claims exclusive ownership over who and what counts as human." The welcoming ceremony was also a way to reclaim indigenous sovereignty, and you hear that in the comment that I just read. He goes on to say, "It means something much different if you're being welcomed by the original peoples versus a colonial government. It means that the United States as a settler nation does not have the final say on who or what comes into the country because it's not theirs to own. When we do that as indigenous people, it's reclaiming our sovereignty, our citizenship, and more importantly, our kinship." Okay, so while the Muslim ban has ended under Biden, deportations have not. If you've been following the news even this week, he's already broken promises on that. But from a larger point of view, to be more general, the conditions that produced the Muslim ban in the first place remain intact. And those conditions are, of course, not new. So as my colleague Junaid Rana reminds us, the figure of the Muslim as religious and racialized can be traced back to 1492 in the US. The history of the very idea of race developed out of religious sentiments in which the Muslim Moor and the Indian in the so-called New World were racialized against one another in a triangulation with the white European. And as Greta LaFleur demonstrates in The Natural History of Sexuality in Early America, sodomy had considerable power as a racializing figure. She argues the criminalization of sodomy may have derived from its association with Muslims. So the historical movement towards a modern conception of race formed the emergent racial capitalism that was the springboard of European expansion, settler colonialism, and New World slavery. Roughly 30% of the enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were Muslims, and probably 5% of those who were brought to what, of course, became the US. So I want to begin with a figure that I think is very familiar to many of you. This is Omar Ibn Saeed, who's the son of a wealthy farmer, spent over 25 years as a prolific scholar and a Muslim religious leader in what we now call Senegal. When Ibn Saeed was about 37 years old, however, an army came to his home, killed many people, captured him, and sold him into slavery. So he was forcibly converted to Christianity, and he would write Quranic verses and pass them off as the Lord's Prayer in Arabic as souvenirs for devout Christian settlers. Now, out of all of his Arabic manuscripts, he's best known for his autobiographical work or essay, which has been translated by, of course, UNC professors Carl Ernst and Bashir Lowe, and is the basis of an opera by Rihanna Giddens that I'm also working on in the book that I'm working on now. So written in 1831, this is the only Arabic autobiography penned by an enslaved African in the US, and it reflects his lifelong devotions to Islam. Saeed begins with Surah Al-Mulk, a chapter from the Quran, which states that only God has sovereignty over human beings. So my talk today is derived in part from my current book project and also an interdisciplinary initiative that I'm part of at the University of Toronto called Reading Muslims, which I take that I take that term reading Muslims to have multiple meanings in relation to the keywords of race, religion, and empire. In the contemporary context, we can talk about the racialization of Islam as a reading of Muslim bodies or those presumed to be Muslim, of course, often Sikhs in the contemporary context. In the context of the global war on terror, we can talk about the anxieties and political stakes of modern liberal states around how Muslims read their texts, and especially the Quran, as Mahmoud analyzed so beautifully in her article, Secularism, Hermeneutics, and Empire, in which the problem for right-wing think tanks is not only jihadists, but so-called moderate Muslims who are theologically invested in the truth of their scripture. This also, I think, came out in the excellent paper by Allison this morning on how to translate Huri. But reading Muslims also gets at the animating impulse of the anthropology of Islam, as outlined by Dalal Asad, my teacher, who in the idea of the anthropology of Islam first redirected anthropologists away from finding the right scale of analysis to formulating the right concepts, specifically a more rigorous conceptualization of tradition as a set of discourses connected to an exemplary past and to interpretations of foundational texts that Muslims draw on in their ordinary lives. So before turning to my current book project, which brings together Asad's questions about the anthropology of Islam and the anthropology of the secular, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about critical Muslim studies as a field or a subfield and its relationship to fields such as critical ethnic studies, Black studies, indigenous studies, as well as religious studies and Islamic studies. All of these places are the places I consider intellectual homes, and they're all in the context of the current contemporary political moment. These are all parts of the academy that are under siege. As we know, religious studies departments are being closed. People with even have tenure are losing their jobs. And this is also, of course, we have the larger backdrop of the adjunctification of the university as a whole and the longstanding problems there of the neoliberals, the neoliberal university. So I just want to put that as sort of a backdrop and then I'm going to tie this back in. So of course, we all know that in the kind of dominant American racial imaginary, Islam is imagined as, anti-modern with more cruel punishments. and the most explicit moral sanction of violence, misogyny, homophobia compared to any other religion. And it's also kind of seen as the most religion-y of all the religions. And so although the specter of Islam is typically framed in terms of recent moral panics, what Judith Weisenfeld calls the religio-racial category of the Moor or the Sodomite Turk, the Mohammedan, the Arab, and now the Muslim have always figured in modern race thinking. Yet too often scholars reproduce a shallow periodization of this so-called Muslim problem, particularly when the complexity of racial ontologies and epistemologies of difference are not taken into consideration. So often the threat of a particular Muslim group is constructed in relation to a more benign Muslim group in ways that are not always fully captured by Mahmoud Mamdani's titular analytical frame of good Muslim, bad Muslim. As much as I love that book and still teach it, there are some limitations. So consider, for example, the reversal of bad Muslims in the American national imagination during the Cold War from demonizing domestic Black Islam as dangerous and pathological, contrasted against a benign global so-called Orthodox Islam, to the erasure of Black Muslims once the Muslim world, imagined to be a real place populated with brown bodies, became the quintessential source of danger, violence, and anti-modernism, particularly after the Iranian Revolution. And of course, our colleague Jamil Aden shows us this in his wonderful book, The Idea of the Muslim World. So critical Muslim studies, I think, crosses all of these different race and ethnic studies subfields, Black studies, Asian American studies, Arab American studies, but it also has a place in religious studies and in the anthropology of the secular. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, is that how do we think about racialization of Islam, not in this sort of additive formulation that it's sometimes talked about. So here I'll go back to Audra Simpson and Andrea Smith, who write, a critical ethnic studies is not a melting pot for diverse racialized identity groups. It is a coalitional intellectual project that seeks to assess the intersecting logics of white supremacy, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism. And so, so the question is, in other words, what is the critical in critical Muslim studies? And this is what I think it is. So in other words, so critical Muslim studies does not erase the need for an autonomous space for Islamic studies as a field, or the anthropology of Islam as a subfield, or Muslims. Rather, it provides a space for us to expand the impact of scholarship about Islam and Muslims and race and empire through diverse academic formulations. And so in this way, I think of critical Muslim studies not as a kind of subfield, but more along the lines of a kind of transdisciplinary formation, the way that critical security studies is, or secularism studies might be, in which in both of those fields just is the Muslim is also a kind of foundational figure. I also just want to say that I think one of the kind of core ideas is that the kind of anxiety around using Islamophobia as a term, because it frames discrimination as a phobia, which suggests that it's a problem of individual bias or individual fear. It has a kind of depoliticizing quality. The shift to anti-Muslim racism highlights how it is interrelated with other forms of racism, such as anti-Arab, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-Latinx, anti-Indigenous racisms. And so I'm trying to draw on theory of intersectionality and think about anti-Muslim racism as a product of settler societies and states emerged in imperial warfare across the globe. And this has really been where my ethnographic and historical research has taken me over the last 20 years, thinking about the war on terror, thinking about the contemporary Islamic revival. And so I see my transnational research agenda as in line with the trends in American studies, transnational American studies, ethnic studies, Black studies, and other fields, to resist the imposition of the nation state and Cold War regions of interest, whether it's the Middle East or another region, as a kind of unit of analysis. And of course, I think it's important for us to remember in this moment that ethnic studies and African American studies departments and programs were originally a response and a compromise to the radical demands of scholar activists to reshape scholarship and curricula to confront the war, or the violence of war, colonialization, and imperialism, and link the conditions and struggles of people of color in the U.S. With those of people in Africa, Asian, and Latin America. And then in religious studies, I think one of the features of that, one of the problems in those fields is a kind of allergy to religion. And so a lot of the important work that I think is critical to what we might call critical Muslim studies, or important to that field, is actually coming out of religious studies. And so part of what I want us to think about today is the connection of these fields. And most recently for me, I've been working I've been done some field work in Greece with Muslim refugees who are, have a kind of their own sort of Muslim leftist critique and have these networks of care, so what they call refugee to refugee care, and so that's what the image is there that you see of this these young boys holding this sign that says capitalism is haram. And so that's part of what I'm also thinking through, is the nature of these fields, or the relationship of these fields and politics on the ground. It's also, so in other words, we're taking our direction from Muslim, from lived religion, as it were. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about trends in the scholarship on religion and scholarship on race that have been moving, I think, in the same direction from different places. So scholarship on race, and I'm talking about the period since when I presented at Duke almost 17 years ago to now, I feel like the scholarship on race has moved away from adjudicating the biological and socially constructed nature of race to the study of racialization. And what I mean by racialization is the set of ideas, institutions, practices, and technologies that maintain a racial regime and which enables the flows of capital. And scholarship on religion and religious studies, I think, has moved from documenting beliefs, communities, practices identified as religion to also studying secularism critically, how the very possibilities of what religion can be are historically contingent and are managed by power externally and internally. And so, of course, we know that secularism is the force or the presence that clears a space for the absence of religion, but it also sets the racial terms by which religion can be spoken and heard. And so here I'm thinking with Vincent Lloyd, who writes on whiteness as secular, right? And so he says, in the US, whiteness is secular, the secular is white, the unmarked racial category and the unmarked religious category jointly mark the others. Or put another way, the desire to stand outside religion and the desire to stand outside race are complementary delusions. And so this idea of standing outside of religion and outside of race is a theme that I want to come back to later. And so I think just going back to this transdisciplinary field, interdisciplinary fields that we might call critical Muslim studies, I think I speak for myself and others identified with the field when I say we cannot and do not take race and religion as simply facts about a person, aspects of identity that correspond to boxes on the census, which of course itself is a biopolitical tool that it could be weaponized and was weaponized by the Trump administration. And I think, as Juliana Hammer, my colleague and friend Juliana Hammer, raised in the first panel, whenever we talk about race in Islam, and especially when we talk about it in pre-modern, in regard to pre-modern Muslims, there is this sense of a gotcha quality. So in my view, that tells us a lot more about how our racial now than it does about the past, and the always political uses of that history. Now, Muslims themselves are also, of course, very much invested in narratives about the Islamic past, the Ummah concept, the idea of the Muslim world, and this is partly what my first book was about, which, Islam is a foreign country. I try to take up these global debates about American Muslims. What does it mean to be Muslim and American? Who has the authority to speak for Islam? And I should just say that these are also the guiding questions in Juliana's work. Her book, More Than a Prayer and Peaceful Families, is also grappling with these questions. And for the grad students, I would just say, if you can, as early as you can, identify those peers, colleagues that are stuck on the same questions that you're thinking about in the shower, those are going to be people that you're going to be thinking with for a long time. And Juliana, for me, is one of those people. And so one of the things that this book, my first book, took up was thinking about these debates around religious authority. And so I sort of show a wide spectrum of American Muslim movements and transnational pedagogical networks that connect the Middle East to the U.S. And I try to be very even-handed in how I represented, whether they're the Salafis or Sufis or Imam Mu'adh Muhammad's community or the Nation of Islam. I wanted to sort of give a much longer history. Really, the argument of that book is not to take a stand on any of the kind of religious normative debates that these American Muslims are having with Muslims in the Middle East, but to show the normative argument of that book really is about race and the foundational blackness of American Islam, which of course many others have also written about, including my colleague Sylvia Chan Malik's recent book, Being Muslim, which is a wonderful text. And also I think she does a much better job of showing the centrality of gender, to that history than I do. But this is I think what collectively as a group of scholars that we are trying to think through this question, and to think about the ways in which race has been constitutive of American Muslims' religious debates really from the beginning. And so the purpose of that book is really to turn terms like political Islam or the Muslim world or even radical Muslim youth on their head. So political Islam is a term that's almost always used to refer unselfconsciously to Islamic movements that originate in the heart of the so-called Muslim world and travel out, including to the US. And of course, in the US, to be Muslim is to be a political subject. This requires us to see communities like the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple, the Ahmadiyya, as no less political and no less Muslim than movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood. And also to see a figure like Malcolm X, who of course, the anniversary, he's our Shaheed Malcolm X, who was killed, the anniversary is tomorrow, was killed in the Ottoman Ballroom in 1965, and to see someone like him as also a talib al-ilm, as someone who was also a student trying to study the tradition and was also part of these kinds of transnational Muslim networks. And so that first book was really to challenge a persistent racial and territorial bias that maps true Islam to foreign and Eastern lands and brown bodies, not by turning the focus away from the Middle East, but actually trying to think about the connections between the US and the Middle East. And the second edition will be out in a few months with a new preface that considers the effects of the Trump presidency, the Muslim ban, and Me Too movement and others on it. So I hope you will look at that if you're interested. But I'm going to spend the rest of my time today talking about the book that I hope to finish soon, which is a book about the social life of the Quran in apodized sense. I'm trying to track the Quran in order to chart the production of an American discourse about the Quran, the production of an American racial common sense view of Islam, in order to demonstrate how race thinking about the Quran is intimately entangled in Americans' cultural constructions of national identity, belonging, and good religion and American secularism. So I think for all of us, it's still fresh in our mind, this image of Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, the QAnon supporting Republican, racing through the hallways, trying to force Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib to retake their congressional oaths on the Bible, because they did it on the Quran, which in her view is illegitimate. So that's something that I'm trying to write about right now. Of course, building on Denise Bellberg's work, which looked at Keith Ellison's swearing in ceremonies, which were also these moments of political these kind of moral panics emerged then too. And of course, Bruce Lawrence's wonderful book, The Quran in English. Also Richard Newton's Identifying Roots, about Alex Haley's roots. And, so there's a number of scholars. Also, of course, Omid Safi, who's working on a book on the reception and racialization of Rumi. So there's sort of a set of scholars that I'm thinking with around the anthropology of scriptures. And over the course of doing the research for this book, I've started developing an archive of protests featuring highly ritualized Quran burnings, such as the one that happens on every anniversary of 9/11, or this one that there's some images from it. This one that happened in the wake of the San Bernardino shootings. And without fail, there's always a kind of counter protest that draws a crowd larger than the crowd there to burn the Quran. And often the Quran, sometimes doused in gasoline, is sort of rescued by someone before it's actually burned. So in 2010, Jacob Isom rescued a Quran from a park grill in Amarillo, and that became a meme and a club track. I'm not going to play it for you, but you can listen to it on YouTube if you want to. And so today, what I want to argue is that the Quran is one of the most iconic objects in contemporary US culture wars, and perhaps second only to the hijab, and also, of course, a text object that figures prominently in the US's actual wars. So you may be surprised, as I was, over the course of my research by how pervasive staged violence enacted on the Quran actually is. So in 2019, YouTube removed, after agitation on the part of Muslims and others, thousands of videos of almost invariably white American men shooting copies of the Quran for sport. And you saw an image of that in the previous slide. And these videos actually have since been migrated to Pornhub, which might not make a lot of sense at first, but if you think about how race and sexuality are often co-constituted, it actually does make sense that that's where they went. So I'm trying to kind of use these moments as sort of windows into the racial logics that are animating them. Consider, for example, this relatively minor controversy in 2008. A U.S. military sniper's desecration of the Quran and use of the book for target practice in Baghdad led to widespread protests within and beyond Baghdad, threatening the U.S. military's fragile alliance with Sunni forces. So a former college quarterback and Christian, Major General Jeffrey Hammond, made a public apology to the Iraqi protesters, and Colonel Ted Martin deferentially kissed a new Quran before handing it to the local sheikh, who nervously accepted the Quran and the apology. The two starkly opposed images, photos of a shredded Quran pierced by an American soldier's bullets and video of a uniform-clad decorated U.S. colonel kissing the Quran, circulated on CNN and other mainstream media together. And talking heads debated whether the general's conciliatory gesture was evidence of Americans' characteristic tolerance of all faiths, merely a pragmatic military tactic intended to stave off a violent backlash from Sunni insurgents, or whether this was in fact the general's acquiescence to the pressures of liberal political correctness. In other words, how we might phrase it today is, out of fear of being canceled, he kissed the Quran. And so these debates about whether American efforts to promote tolerance confused respectful behavior with reverent behavior, and expressed anxiety that American values, ideals, and even secularism were being compromised in service of the promotion of tolerance. And so here I'm thinking, of course, with Wendy Brown, who in Regulated Aversion powerfully demonstrates that tolerance is not a transcendent or universal concept, principle, doctrine, or virtue. Rather, it is a discourse of power. In its civilizational register, it is always a racial discourse enveloping a wide range of political purposes, agents, and objects, in this case, the Islamic text object. So what we see reflected in the fleeting media coverage of that particular Quran controversy, or the one recently with the swearing in, is this larger pattern in which a set of twin debates pivot on the related questions. And so one set of debates is how much we as Americans should tolerate Muslims in the US. And the second set of debates is about how the US as a benevolent democratic empire should make tolerant Muslim societies abroad. And so I'm trying to think about these two, the division of these two debates and how they're connected to each other. So in the former debate, of course, the question is how much the majority, those that do not require tolerance, ought to tolerate this racialized minority, i.e. Muslims who require it. And of course, in the latter debate, tolerance operates very differently. It is a key racial and civilizational marker in the construction of difference between the US and the supposedly intolerant Muslim world that needs to be taught tolerance through US state policy, humanitarian efforts, and of course, war making. So in addition to thinking about these media representations, I'm also tracking the development of particular policies. So to give just like another quick example, shortly after 9/11, the Bureau of Prisons removed all materials from prison libraries that were not on their list of endorsed books out of fear that prisoners, and particularly Black Muslim men, would sympathize with terrorists. And this unprecedented, and it was short-lived, policy not only dictated what books about Islam were forbidden in prisons, but put the government in the position of determining what members of all faiths ought to be reading. So the question of what religious rights Muslim prisoners deserve is a recurring domestic debate about the limits of tolerance, the nature of religious freedom, etc. Now, in contrast, if you consider the debate over the Quran and prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, it's been very different. It seems to me that the primary reason the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay have been given a Quran is to use it as a tool of torture. So former inmates report that the physical abuse of the text was a regular form of torture: ripping, dropping, urinating, defecating, spitting, vomiting, pouring menstrual blood on the Quran were all acts allegedly performed by US military personnel, either in Guantanamo or elsewhere around the world, revealing how racial, national, gender, and sexual ideologies shape the state's policies and the political theater around the Islamic text object. And so as I'm trying to write up this material, I'm thinking with Spillers and the kind of the way the fleshiness of the Quran in these moments of political theater, which are so disturbing. So what I'm hoping that this book will do is it will deepen our understanding about the complexity and diversity of Americans' political and cultural interests in Islam over time. So as we'll see today, American political interests in Islam are complex and neither uniformly negative nor always in service of US empire. And by examining policies and controversies since 9/11 and tracking the social lives of particular Quran text objects, so I'm thinking about Thomas Jefferson's Quran and Malcolm X's Quran, Omar Ibn Saeed's staging of his writing. I mean, I want to think about those in relation to these debates. And I show in the book the range of political meanings assigned to the Quran and how popular culture is an active part of constructing the narratives that make official policies make sense to an American public. And I challenge the parochial disciplinary assumptions that the Quran's meanings are determined by Muslims always, and that I'm trying to model the task of theorizing and documenting fields of social life that I think are difficult to render. So, in other words, I'm trying to think about conceptual frames, and here's where I'm drawing on, as I said, Spillers, through which to focus on race and racialization, but without being always beholden to flesh or skin. And so Anne Cheng's work in ornamentalism has been really helpful. She writes, those of us invested in the critique of power have long been alert to the crisis of persons who've been turned into things, but we should also attend to the ways things have been taken for persons and how this impacts our ideas about human ontology and aliveness. And so just, in showing you this sort of disturbing material, I think it is chilling to absorb that those shot up Qurans stand in for black and brown bodies that the shooters desire to kill. But as I will show, the text subject of the Quran often stands in for Muslim bodies in what we might call Islamophilic registers too. And so I'm trying to track a kind of mirroring that happens. And so my focus on the Quran as a racial object that Americans who are not Muslim need, and here I mean it in James Baldwin's sense, is supplemented by an analysis of the racial experiences of American Muslims vis-a-vis their racialized scripture. And I'll talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested, about my ethnographic case studies and also some of the national survey data I've been drawing on. My findings capture the illegibility of American Muslims' investments and practices, particularly oral practices around the Quran, because of course, in their day-to-day lives, most Muslims experience the Quran as a sound heard or uttered and not a physical page they're reading. Along with questions about lived religion, I investigate American Muslims' racial experiences in which they are routinely and disproportionately, relative to other religious minorities, expected to answer for and explain the so-called controversial verses from their scripture. So that kind of racial litmus test is part of what I'm really interested in. So one fascinating phenomenon that happened after 9/11 was the public rush to buy copies of the Quran with bookstores backordered for weeks. In fact, I at the time was living in Chicago, and I remember I went down to Borders bookstore, which existed back then, and I just wanted to see what was on the shelf, and without missing a beat, the cashier said, "Oh, the terrorism section is right there." When I asked, "Where is the Islam section?" So that itself tells you just how that immediately happened. And so in bookstores after 9/11, you had just this incredible demand for English copies of the Quran, and all these people who wanted to read it for themselves. And so on the one hand, this demand might be seen as sort of, and some people argue this, a kind of reflection of Americans' tolerance of different faiths. But on the other hand, critics, and I'm here thinking of Mamdani, argue that it was not a natural reflex, but a cultural reflex to turn to the Quran in order to understand terrorism and to look for the verses that made it happen, made 9/11 happen, rather than a pre-modern historical account, a modern historical account of the Cold War or of Al-Qaeda. And so this, I think, reflects a characteristically American scripturalist tendency towards religion, as well as a racist logic that depends on two very different understandings of culture. American culture is understood to be dynamic, creative, modern, and the cultures of the racialized Muslim other are seen as essentially empty habit, mindless conformity to lifeless customs, mummified rules inscribed in ancient texts. To sum up Mamdani's argument about culture talk, we have culture, their culture has them. in order to explore why so many Americans were drawn to these essentialist culturalist explanations of the attacks rather than political ones. This is what Toni Morrison calls, willful blindness, the kind of hard work not to see. I want to just draw your attention to Munir Fatmi's installation. I'm thinking this might be the cover of my book, I hope, inshallah. But I think this to me captures that, where you see that he has, all of these Americans trying to read Muslims to understand 9/11, and Americans, I'm just thinking about like the ways in which those you've all these people they're reading the Quran to understand what happened, and then there are the Americans that want to read Muslim bodies and read Muslims by shooting a Quran. And so in some ways, like both of them might find themselves in the aisle of Barnes and Noble or Borders reaching for a Quran at the same time. So that's part of what I'm kind of trying to think through, that puzzle. So this desire to read the Quran myself became a pervasive liberal form of political witnessing after 9/11 and to this day, and it operates as a racial alibi and a deflection from accusations of bigotry in much the same way the invocation of Black friends is simultaneously used as a license to make a racist claim while being presumably insulated from scrutiny, as well as a claim to objective authority as an outsider. So going back to Vincent Lloyd here, and a form of cosmopolitan social capital, which positions the reader to recognize essential value or its absence. In other words, non-Muslim Americans' claims to have read the Quran are the scaffolding for arguments both for and against tolerating Muslim minorities, and both for demonizing and defending Islam. And the fact that such claims to intimate knowledge of Islam and or Muslims center a scripture rather than actual Muslim people is typically left uninterrogated. And by the way, the Academy reproduces this exact same thing too, which I'm happy to talk about too. So for the rest of the time that I have, I'm just going to focus on one chapter of this book in which I provide close readings of three kinds of what I'm calling non-traditional translations of the Quran aimed at American publics who want to read it for themselves. So first is this category of how to read instructional guidebooks and textbooks. Here I'm thinking of the Quran for Dummies, Michael Sell's Approaching the Quran, textbooks, Carl Ernst's How to Read the Quran, A New Guide. And then I'm thinking about the Islamophobic correlate, or the Islamophobia industry's cultural production. So Robert Spencer's The Complete Infidel's Guide to the Quran. And then what I'm going to focus on today for the rest of this time is these artistic representations of the Quran that are sympathetic engagements with the Islamic scripture and political interventions in national debates about religious and racial tolerance and inclusion. So I'm going to talk about three artists who've created these visual translations of the Quran: painter Sandow Birk, weaver Meg Hitchcock, who stitches a Quran out of a shredded Bible and other books, and graphic novelist Craig Thompson. By abstracting and aestheticizing the text object, these visual artists translate the Quran and make it more readable in order to make a set of humanistic claims about the Quran's universality and its aesthetic power to inspire. Okay, so let's begin with Birk. So Birk has produced a fascinating and unique illuminated Quran based on what he calls his fake naive stance, that the Quran ought to be able to speak to him unmediated and without context, just as a Bible in the hotel drawer might. What emerges is a highly personalized rendering of every 2 pages of the Quran as a standalone painting. And Birk purposely and strategically chose not to study the meanings of the Quran to Muslims, and unsurprisingly, Muslim viewers of the exhibit reported they found a disconnect often between Birk's paintings and the Quran they know. In other words, part of the trick of looking at his paintings is to figure out which verse connects to the image in the backdrop, and it's often not the verse that may be most meaningful to Muslims in those passages that they know. So Birk is playing with Islamic aesthetic forms, Persian miniatures, calligraphy, but also juxtaposes them with graffiti and banal images of everyday life. So here you see the Fatiha and, the instead of the arabesque, which of course is such a important Islamic art form, the idea that you hear that arabesque operates as a kind of knot of highways in Los Angeles. And so that's the way he's sort of playing with calligraphy and these other forms, both visually, but he's also making the Quran into a kind of anthropological mirror. That sort of ethnographic idiom of making the exotic familiar and the familiar exotic. That's sort of the idea here. He's scrutinizing the beliefs and behaviors of ordinary Americans in much the same way as they typically scrutinize Muslim societies. And so you see the jihad verses in the American Quran are set against images of the US military in Iraq. Here's Guantanamo Bay. We have, of course, the carceral borders of the US. This is in Arizona. And even extending to outer space. I think maybe some of you watched the landing yesterday. Okay, so these images sometimes operate as parables and fictionalized documentary evidence for the Quran's messages. So, for example, you know, we have the story of Prophet Noah's flood, which might be easily dismissed as a kind of abstraction. So Burke makes it real and immediate for a contemporary audience through scenes of Hurricane Katrina's devastation, right? So Burke's American Quran tests both Islam's claim to universality and the universal citizenship promised by American democracy. If Islam is for all times and all places, as Muslims claim, can a white guy who is not Muslim accept the Quran's invitation to read, reflect on, and interpret its verses without being accused of cultural trespass, without getting canceled, without all of that, right? Or will Muslims protest that this message and book is only ours or is our cultural property, which, you know, is presumably in direct conflict with what the Quran says about itself, right? So that, now I should say, in terms of his framing of his project, Burke is very clear that he remains unconvinced of any claims of divinity, but he is seeking answers to big questions. And he shows the readers the ways the Quran's history, not its metaphysics, moves him. And of course, his language is visual and not oral. You know, does the Quran have anything to say to a 21st century American? That's kind of the animating question of the project. So here's here Burke is pairing the image of a foreclosed house with a chapter from the Quran entitled "The Cheaters," and I think the answer to that question, what he's saying is that yes. In other words, when we read the verse, woe to the cheaters who demand full measure when they take from others and short them when they measure for them. And I have to say that that verse, you know, resonates so deeply in this pandemic as we think about also in particular Texas right now. But that is what Burke is saying, is that this book has a message that is relevant and important for everyone to be reading. So let's move to Meg Hitchcock's work. Meg Hitchcock has reconstructed a rendering of the Book of Revelations from letter cutouts of the Quran using a gallery, walls, floor, and ceiling as her easel. So while Burke is fusing genres by drawing on Persian miniatures and calligraphy and American graffiti to create his painted Quran, Hitchcock is fusing tapestry and collage techniques to create a knitted rope of competing scriptures, right? So like Burke, her exhibit foregrounds the words of scripture as the primary object of visual interest. And like Burke, the words the viewer encounters are disjointed and jarring due to the way the braiding interrupts the biblical narrative or the Quranic narrative, depending on which one she's doing. In a few spots, Hitchcock highlights a phrase or a sentence, but for the most part, the sense is that the words have been randomly arranged in order to disembody the two texts by making a chapter out of the Bible, a chapter of the Bible out of the Quran, or a chapter of the Quran out of the Bible. Hitchcock wants to emphasize the interchangeability of the scriptures of these two universal traditions, Islam and Christianity, and the malleability and easy manipulation of both texts. So some of her more recent work becomes political in, I think, troubling ways. So this is just an example of what it looks like close up. So you can see that you can't really see what it's all very disjointed. But this is sort of the more political direction it starts to take towards the end of the project. And so here you see that she's constructed the Quran's chapter, the women, Nisa, from Surah Nisa, from an old copy of The Feminine Mystique, or in another work, Emily Dickinson's novels. And so, like Burke, Hitchcock's emphasis on the interchangeable quality of the two books and her freedom to borrow across traditions, like Burke's freedom to read without context, serves as both a challenge to the religious authenticity of the Quran, a kind of, you know, inspire me if you can, but also as an artistic claim to license that is unbound by any tradition or any community. And that is something that's really come up in my interviews with Muslims who visited these exhibits. This is the primary political message of both installations. And as white American atheists, and they do frame themselves, that's part of the staging, they are interpolated as proper, rational, free-thinking readers. And therefore, this work ultimately, while it has many merits, and I should confess, I actually wrote the foreword to Burke's coffee table book version of it, the work ultimately leaves intact the kind of race thinking and racial anxieties about Muslims who read. And so that's, something that I want us to reflect and linger on. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So finally, the last white American atheist or agnostic artist I'm going to show you is graphic novelist Craig Thompson's novel, Habibi, which takes Quranic myths and mystical traditions of numerology associated with the Quran as a beautiful backdrop to a modern day 1001 Arabian Nights. And you can see the book actually kind of looks like a Quran if you can sort of see it. It's sort of intended to have that resemble the text itself. To look like a mushaf. So the story of the novel is a love story which ends in a futuristic dystopia where the world is swimming in garbage and water bottling companies are hoarding water as most of the world dies of thirst. And I have to say, just returning to this material today in the context of everything that's happening in Texas is just really so troubling. But it also shows you the way these texts, come to have layers of meaning as they move after they've been originally, published. So Thompson's story is beautiful and moving and deeply disturbing, with graphic sexual imagery juxtaposed against depictions of Quranic stories, and he draws on, Orientalist tropes, Arabic calligraphy, Quranic narratives, but purely as aesthetic points of departure. And so, I think in many ways it's beautifully executed, but Thompson essentially depicts the Quran as a book of stories and magic numbers, closely related to biblical narratives, but departing on, key details, beautiful, but also troubling. And that's kind of how he looks at the Bible too. So while Thompson's story is a profound political critique of racism, modern day human trafficking, and environmental abuse by global corporations, he does not bring the Quran to bear on any of this. So this is in some ways very different from Burke. While Thompson depicts the Quran as beautiful, alluring, and complex, the social justice message of the Quran is totally left out of this book, and the Quran is left out of politics in his rendering. So, as I said, although Burke and Thompson do make explicit critiques of US empire in their work, I am struck by how profoundly depoliticized these artistic works are when we consider the way they represent the Quran. The political courage is framed as their willingness to work with the Quran, to read the Quran, and risk offending the sensibilities of Muslims who are read as presumably too quick to erupt into violence in the face of art that they don't like or understand. So these non-Muslim artists' works that draw on the Quran fixate on the Quran as a text object that does not require study, but requires aestheticization in order to make it accessible. And so I do want to end on an artist, a Muslim artist, Baba, whose I think work stands in sharp contrast to the work that I've shown you so far today. So Junaid Rana and others, oops, sorry, this is out of place. Let me see. Just going to skip a little bit. So Junaid Rana has argued that Baba's work uses fantasy and the divine as sources from which to juxtapose the ordinary with the extraordinary to index the fraught US-Pakistan alliance. Baba is known mostly for her scriptures, offers a political critique of global politics, war, environmental catastrophe, and the effects of racial capitalism. In this piece, the garbage bag is both veil and prison, the hands outstretched before the body in sujood or in death. There's a kind of ghastly tale that indexes the ways in which the prostrating Muslim body is made animal and deprived of human rights. And of course, it invokes places like Pakistan, Guantanamo Bay, the carceral borders of the US, Fortress Europe, but also, of course, US prisons and places like right now, Texas or Flint, Michigan. Baba's sculpture is a commentary on how the war on terror is related to the late modernism of neoliberal capitalism that accelerates decay, ecological disasters, genocide. So I'm bringing this up not to argue about the merits of Baba's work in comparison to the other works shown, although I could make that argument, but rather to just simply say, I want to highlight just a kind of key sensory difference in how the Quran is conceived and approached artistically here. So Baba's work is one that captures the orality of the Quran, that is such a constitutive part of lived Islam, something that is lost, I think, in all of the other work that I've shown you today. And so for me, and I perhaps for some of you, I'm kind of overcome with chills as I absorb the work's political meanings. But I can also hear the Quran in my mind's ear, and maybe some of you can as well. So I'll stop there, and thank you. I think we're going to take questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Graywal. That was a fantastic talk. I can see that some of the questions are starting to, trickle in, and we can get that conversation started. I'll go ahead and start off with the first question. This one comes from Yasmin Falinali. She asks, thank you so much for your presentation. It's so wonderful to have you here with us. In your research, how have you found that Muslim Americans' relationship to and perception of the Quran is influenced by anti-Muslim hostility?
Yeah, that's a really helpful question. So I have to say, I really, the project for me came out of this idea of the litmus test that American Muslims are asked to endure, where they are asked to basically play religious studies professors. They were, they're asked to explain, contextualize, defend verses of the Quran that they may not even be familiar with, and these sort of like water cooler moments, right? Or like on planes, or just like in ordinary life. And it's very difficult. So it's just, I mean, to me, this is not new. Like for me, that happened when I was a kid, when Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses came out, and my teacher thought he had a gotcha moment when he said, I told him, my parents hate this book. And he said, well, have they read it? And what I wish I had been able to say was, well, they read the title, which is the insult part. I mean, you're saying the Quran is from Satan. They don't need to read the whole thing to understand this is intended as a racial insult, or they can take it as a racial insult. But I didn't have the vocabulary or the ability to sort of show anything besides my defiance and my behavior, because I couldn't articulate what I wanted to really say. And that is a frustration that over the, for many, many years, I've heard various iterations of that feeling, of feeling unable to defend, to being asked to be able to defend, feeling, and one of the saddest parts of it to me is I often encounter Muslim college students who confess that they are afraid to read the Quran, and because they're afraid of encountering exactly these kinds of verses and then not having an answer for it, and then their faith or their iman will be destroyed, and so they actually have developed a kind of anxiety about reading the Quran. And so that to me is so tragic. And so part of what has happened is I've talked about, especially Sando Burke's work in different universities, is, I sort of leave those moments and say, well, if this white surfer atheist artist in LA found something beautiful and inspiring and, powerful in his reading of the Quran, maybe you should have the courage to just open it up and read it. And you might find things that will trouble you and make you question, and that's okay. But you may also find other things beyond simply, things that are going to put you in a defensive posture with people. And I think for any of us who are public Muslims, I mean, I think about I get certain verses tweeted at me from bigots all the time, like as gotcha moments, like respond to this, and so I think of these as sort of like these like bigoted huffaz. I mean, they sort of have their own hifs of like these like 10, 12 verses that they all know and they repeat. And so that's partly what I wanted to track, is like, how does the Quran become reduced to these verses? How are those verses deemed controversial? What is this? And then how are American Muslims sort of triangulated and asked to respond to this in a way that, of course, no other religious tradition is expected to do that. And I mean, no other religious community. And so I know that just because I am part of American Muslim communities, and I know that's a common racial experience, but the difficulty has been like, how do you document something like that? And so now I actually, with my collaborations with both Pew and ISPU, I've worked there for, worked with them for 20 years now. I have actually statistical data where I can show you that America, if you ask a question about how often are you asked to defend controversial verses from your scripture, you can see that Muslims are disproportionately asked compared to other people. So I have kind of like the proof of it, although we all already know it. And so that is, to me, the most troubling part of it is not just the microaggression in and of itself of being asked, but that it also engenders an actual anxiety among Muslims themselves about what's in the Quran, and also that there's a complete blindness to the way the actual like experience of the Quran on a daily basis. So for most Muslims, they're not sitting there puzzling over 434, and in some ways, in other words, like what is the actual lived experience of the Quran day to day? And that's part of what I want to get at, is that like, how do we think about this? What's being lost? And I have to say also, I think that there's in some ways, we in the academy reproduce this racial dynamic, right? In our obsessive focus on the quote unquote controversial verses. So I wanted to write a book about the Quran that had nothing to do with tafsir. That I just did not want to get into how Muslims read it, because and then there's wonderful work that has been done on tafsir, and I'm not criticizing that work as a body of work, but I wanted to get at this other stuff that we often don't look at. So that's really, and so I really should say, I mean, this book, my first book, all of my work is always for the communities that I love and grew up in. And so that's really what this book is about.
Great, thank you. That was such a great answer. There are more questions flowing in, so I'm gonna direct one to, there's one from Samach Chaudhry, and she says, thank you, Dr. Graywal. I'm curious to hear a bit more about how you're thinking about the racial anxiety you noticed radiating off these pieces, particularly the Sandow Burke Quran. And before you answer that, I do want to make it clear to the audience to please direct the questions not in the chat, but in the Q&A section. Makes it easier for us to manage that, so thank you. Would you like for me to repeat that question, or?
Yeah, could you repeat the question? Okay. I think I just missed the part of it because my headphone just went out for a second.
Sure. Someone asks, I'm curious to hear a bit more about how you're thinking about the racial anxiety you noticed radiating off these pieces, particularly the Sandow Burke Quran.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So the Sandow Burke, I can talk a little bit about this, and I will. I have to say, so when I agreed to write the preface to the coffee table book, they pay you a little honorarium or something, and I actually said to him, I actually want one of the paintings instead of being paid to do this. And my husband was like nervous because he's like, wait, what is this? Like, is this like a Rushdie thing? What's going on here? Like, what are you getting us into? And this is, so there, I have to say, first I should say that I have my own anxieties about being part of the project, but so I just want to preface it by saying that. But one thing that came up for me in that project, and the reason, so it's like I wanted to think about that, like, what is it about my husband's anxiety or my anxiety to even have written, and to sort of, because I mean, I do know that everyone who wrote a kind of preface, it was like a bunch of, it was Reza Aslan and me and a few other people, and we were clearly like the brown Muslim barrier, to this project, or like a kind of protective. So I understand that I'm being used in that way, and I'm obviously okay with that. And I let myself be used in that way. But I did have some friends that were like, "This is like, this is not the wokest thing you've ever done, Zarina. Like, why are you doing this?" And I have my reasons. And part of the reason is because I think the project is actually really interesting. I know Bruce Lawrence loves it a lot more than I do, but I do love it. There are a lot of things I love about the project. But I wanted to think about that anxiety, is like, what makes people nervous? And one of the things that makes people nervous is this project is the first that I know of, and I think there may be others, but it's one of, if not the only, illuminated Quran that has people in it. And of course, there's no prophets. By the way, there are in Craig Thompson's Habibi. So there's no prophets depicted, but there are all these people. And sometimes they're at the beach in a bikini, and then you have these Quranic verses. And so there's all this idea of like, well, what does it mean? And so he's trying to show in that, I think, that I can be respectful without being forced to play by Muslim rules, right? And so in my preface to the coffee table book, I really wanted to write about my grandmother and my mother who don't like the American Quran, and that is nothing to do with like I wanted to say this should not be a racial litmus test. It shouldn't be like to prove that you are into, you know, that you can handle democratic, that you can be a democratic citizen, that you have to kind of prove that you have this particular aesthetic taste. Someone can reject it and someone can still be, part of our political community, or can be. I just wanted to talk about that part of it. And so before I published the essay, mostly at the urging of my partner, he said, can you just like talk to some of the religious leaders about your decision? Like just talk out loud why you're doing this, why are you writing the preface, what does this project mean, and all of that. And so I did actually talk to a set of American Muslim religious leaders who I had worked with in my previous book, and just told them what it was. And one of them, it was in Ramadan, and I called him, it was like an iftar. I won't say who it was, but he's a well-known religious scholar. And so I told him what it was, and he said, stop the presses, don't do it. It sounds very haram and bid'ah, and just your life will be destroyed. Do not. This is really bad. And I was like, oh wait, are you sure? Because they're going to press. Like, wait a minute, can we talk? And he was like, I'm at a party. We'll call you later. I'll call you after Tarawih. So I was like, kind of like, okay, flummoxed. Like, wow, this is a big problem. Okay, this is going to be maybe much more controversial than I realize. Let me listen to him and see what he has to say. So then when he called me back, and I was like, Sheikh, you told me, I mean, I've already written the preface. This thing is about to go to print. You really think that like I should pull my piece and not be part of this? Like, let's think about this. Why? And and he starts to say why and his various reasonings, that it's like it goes against the, well, he had a number of reasons of why it was inappropriate. And then in the course of the conversation, it became clear to me that he was under the impression that Sandow Birk was Muslim. When I explained to him that Sandow Birk was an atheist, he was like, "Oh, fine. Oh, then it's fine. Well, then it's totally, then okay. Well, then no problem. Good. I'm sure." And he has, so it's just funny. It really showed me in that moment that Muslim artists are held to a different standard than non-Muslim artists, even by like, religious leaders. So that anxiety about like, is this halal? Is this okay? Is one thing. The racial anxiety, I mean, it's interesting, and I think this is what the question is really getting at, is like, what does it mean to have a white atheist surfer, like critically acclaimed artist, sort of say, yeah, the Quran was worth spending 10 years of my life on, and he did spend, an enormous amount of energy doing this. There was one point which I was talking to him, interviewing him, and he said something like how charming he found Muhammad by the end of the project, doing this. And it was like almost as if he was telling me like he found my grandfather charming. I mean, I was like, well, what do I say to it? Thank you. I don't know. I mean, so this is part of what I want to think about, is like, what does it mean to get like the cosign from these white atheist artists? Like, what is going on there? Whether it's for me as someone writing the preface, whether it's for this, sheikh in a masjid after Tarawih who's like really upset and then is suddenly totally mollified when he finds that the artist is not Muslim, and what does this mean also about cultural appropriation? Like, because I think given the ways in which Muslim, or how the Quran is used, Muslims of course feel protective of it, because it's routinely, just like we feel protective of Rasul for the same reasons that we feel protective, so the Prophet is being abused. This is a racial script that we all know, and so we feel that kind of protection. But that doesn't mean that there can't be, other ways of coming at it. And so I want to think about that, like what is going on there. I hope that answers the
Absolutely.
question. Sorry.
I think that did. I remember seeing Burke at a talk at Duke a little while ago, and a similar kind of conversation took place. And I think you summarized maybe it was like 2-hour talk, and you summarized the whole thing very succinctly right now. So that was great. Thank you. I have a question of my own, but I'm going to hold off on that because we have some new ones in the from the audience. Sama Jaffer asks, thank you for this brilliant keynote. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about how you are grappling with what you refer to as the American scripturalist tendency, informing how the Quran is approached as a text and the understanding of Islam as a textual tradition.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I am to be honest, as I'm writing it, this is not something I've totally puzzled through, but I do think there's something I'm calling the American scripturalist tradition, and honestly, I have to say, this book, Richard Newton's book, Identifying Roots, which takes Alex Haley's roots and traces it through, it thinks about like how that novel and then the TV series worked in the American imagination. I thought this book would be a model for me, but the Quran is much messier as a subject, exactly for the reasons than compared to Alex Haley's roots, for exactly the reasons that are raised in the question. And part of it is because you're dealing with a whole tradition, textual tradition, which is partly what my first book is about. I mean, maybe I made the mistake of writing a second book that's very different from my first book, because my first book is about that textual tradition and how American Muslims are in relation to it, and how that is also a kind of racial relationship, or racialized relationship, as well as being many other things. The problem with thinking about or trying to isolate the Quran and trying to isolate American scripturalism is you get into this loop where it's like, well, we want to talk about secularism as more than just warmed over Protestantism. And yet, how do we make sense of the um, the incredible, like, the kind of intellectual, or the reflex, let's call it the cultural reflex, of someone like Burke, of someone like Hitchcock, of someone like Thompson, to treat the Quran as a book. That all comes out of American Protestant Christianity. And so I'm thinking here of like a wonderful book on American Jews called Orthodox by Design, that talks about the secularization and Protestantization of American Orthodox Judaism. And so that's not what this story is about. So I'm not arguing that American Muslims have been Protestantized. Other people have made that argument, and I myself actually have some questions about that, because I actually think American Muslims, like Muslims around the world, have actually not been totally Protestantized, because of what I said about the orality of the Quran. The Quran, everyday experience for Muslims, there's a lot of ways that Muslims approach the Quran. That could be a necklace, I see necklace. It could be something that's on their wall. It could be something that's playing in the car. It's something that's uttered in prayer or heard in prayer before they go to bed. There's so many other ways besides the idea of the book and understanding what the book really means. And so like I said, I haven't totally figured it out, but I want to talk about American scripturalism as a racial posture more than as a kind of purely like kind of like a direct having a direct genealogy out of American Protestantism.
Great. It looks like there's a question by Dr. Lawrence, and I wanted to address that just because we were talking about Burke. So Dr. Bruce Lawrence writes, hi Zarina, I do love the Burke project, but what I find disappointing, even frustrating, is the reaction of my friends, Muslim and Muslims abroad, who are dismayed how Burke's American Quran is too American. Does he not provincialize the Quran by highlighting his approach as not just American, but post 9/11 American? I would argue we need an American-specific pictorial Quran, but your book will have to provide a corrective beyond what I could have imagined doing. Thanks for the shout outs and insights. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah, well,
Lawrence, for that
I
question.
really am wishing I could talk to Bruce in real life and be together right now. Thank you so much, Bruce. Yeah, I mean, I do think so. The provincializing work that the American Quran does is the part that I like about it. That's actually what I really appreciate about the project. My reservations, one of the funny things that comes out of trying to capture the American Muslim reception to Burke's project, is, some people have said to me, well, we should all do our own, like, American Qurans. Like, we should, I should do a graphic, illuminated Quran where I do my take. So for example, I'll just give you an example. Probably, I talk about this in my first book, the most cited verse in American Muslim religious discourse since the 60s, and I can prove it to you, is the verse about the ummah and race, and we created you in tribes and nations that you know each other, not that you hate each other. This verse is in so many different, if you just look at like American Muslim pulp religious literature, that verse is repeated again and again and again. So the first painting that was sold from Burke's series was the painting that had that verse in it. And he couldn't understand why. And so I looked at it and he said, this is the first one. I wonder why. And in fact, I know the couple that bought it. And he said, I wonder why they bought this particular painting, or what was it about this one? I would have thought the short surahs would be the first ones to go. And of course they did sell quickly. And I said, no, it's because you don't realize that this is the verse. This is, if there's an American Muslim verse that would be like a Quranic, I don't know, what are those things that you bumper sticker or something like that? This would be the one, and so of course this is the first one that you sold, but the backdrop picture has no relationship to that verse because he ended up picking a different verse to base for his. So that disconnect is what I'm trying to capture, is that, like, he approaches this project and just says, what does this mean to me? And it doesn't matter what it means to American Muslims, but who is actually buying the pieces? Not only Muslims, but many American Muslims have bought the pieces, and so they're basically getting. And Leila Lalami and others have written about their own reactions to the priest. So it is very, it's both provincializing, I think, in a really productive way. But then there's also something that's, I guess I would say, individuating. That is where some of the gaps come up for me. And that's also something that I want to think through more carefully. But I, always in conversation with Bruce and Bruce's work. And the Quran in English is a great book that everyone should also read, which is a fascinating account of the transnational networks that produce the Qurans. Which Qurans? Why does Yusuf Ali become Yusuf Ali?
Definitely. That's a great way to put that. I do want to just keep in mind that it's 2:12 and we have until 2:30, and we have about 3 questions left to go right now. So with time in mind, let's move accordingly. This next one comes from Nafisa Andrabi. She writes, "Thank you for this wonderful talk. I loved your line about conceptualizing race and racialization without being beholden to flesh and skin. I have 2 questions. Do you think this Muslim litmus test experience and need to be Islamic studies professors leads to a reactionary Muslim identity formation, as in more strongly identifying as Muslim because of this experience? And second, is American Islam held in contrast to white secularism or white Christianity?"
Yeah, I mean, so I will say that I'll take the second part of the second question first. So in
Okay.
my analytical structure of the argument, I am not holding up American Islam as a kind of coherent thing against secularism or white Christianity. Although I would say that that does happen often in the ways it's talked about or written about in many different registers, including American Muslim ones. For me, I think all these things are secular formations, and so we're never completely outside of it. But yet the racial narrative is that there are these white outsiders that can comment on us and comment on our book, right? So that's what I'm trying to capture there. The first part of the question was about, okay, so what does it mean to become? I mean, I didn't become a religious studies professor because of my teacher calling me out and asking me about satanic verses, whenever that was, a 4th grade. Although I will say that Ayatollah Khomeini has a striking resemblance to my Nana Jan, my grandfather, and so maybe there is some subconscious thing there. But I think I became a religious studies professor because my mother is a very devoted mother, and the only time I was always so puzzled by the fact that when she was in prayer, when she was reading the Quran, that was the only time when I could not draw her attention to myself. So, whatever it was about this book, or whatever it was that she was doing when she was praying, there was some kind of, experience that I was outside of, and that it transcended her motherliness to me. And I think as a kid that was incredibly confusing to me, and that just like the power of that, not just for her as my mom, but also many of the aunties that kind of raised me, they all were like this, and I wanted to understand that. And so that's really what that's who this book is about and for, even though it's not an ethnographic study of like South Asian women's halakas, and Justine Howe has done a great service in that regard, and of trying to capture what American Muslim Quran halakas look like. So there's other people that are doing that kind of work, but that is the animating impulse. So I don't think I became a professor for that reason. But I will say that you know, those guiding experiences, those formative experiences for me, are part of this project. And I think that, you know, it's funny because I think I'm often not even read as a, you know, a Muslim professor in most of my day-to-day life. It's just, you know, it's I experience this in my own identity, but I'm not even sure that so there are many people that would not consider what this project is to even really be Islamic studies proper, because it's not about tafsir, right? So I mean, I'm not particularly interested, or I don't feel defensive among other Muslims in the academy, and I don't feel defensive about it even in, when I'm in an airplane. But what I wanted to mark is that, like, look at how this particular training that I have, which is very specific, is just something that everyone is expected to have if they're like a Muslim living in this society, right? That's really what I want to capture, is like, what is the fetishization of like my nerd life that gets generalized, you know, to the whole population of American Muslims, which is ridiculous. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's what I want to really think about.
Great. We have two more, and hopefully I think we can get through those in time. The first one comes from Dr. Yusuf Carter, who says, "Salam, and thank you for that wonderful mapping of your work. I wonder how we might place your insights on the representations of the Quran as an object, parenthetical, that play a part in the thingification / racialization of Muslims, and parenthetical, in conversation with certain understandings of the Quran that resist thingification." I love that term. That coincide with efforts to push for a kind of humanist impulse. Say, for example, as examined through transmission practices studied by scholars like Rudolf Bilal Ware, I think is the pronunciation.
That's a great question. And like Butch Ware's book, Walking Quran, which I taught many times and love that book and love all of his work. You know, I am really, this book is about the sensory experience of the Quran, both for Muslims, but also for non-Muslims. So at one point, and I abandoned this structure, but I think it gets at it. I mean, at one point I thought about organizing the book in terms of the five senses. In other words, the eye, the ear, you know, taste, smell, you know, how and having it, having a kind of ethnographic account of like, how do, you know, American Muslims smell, like what's the Quranic smell experience, what's the Quranic, you know, the hearing, what's the oral, the eye. The problem with that is, of course, it's too hard to stretch those out. I mean, that's why I love Homa Baba's sculpture that I shared at the end, is that it's incredible to me that a sculpture can induce the oral experience of the Quran, which none of these other works for me can do. Like, that's an incredible feat as just an art, at the art level of an artist, that she's able to create a different kind of sensory experience. She's giving us visual material and maybe even something that we could touch, but the experience that we have as viewers, and at least this is how I experience it, maybe many of you, I mean, you can hear, I mean, you might be incited by that piece to utter the prayer, the verse that you say for someone who's passed, like, you know, that, you know, we are from God and we return to God. Or you may just hear the Quran as being recited and say someone in prayer. Or, I mean, there's many different layers of it. So I thought about doing that and having each chapter think about American Muslim sensory experiences in the way that, you know, Ware's work does, and then have it and then include non-Muslim experiences. Because, like, so for example, like one thing, like for taste, for example, you know, which Ware talks about the drinking of the Quran, of like the kind of the, you know, the erasing of the tablets and having the water and then actually ingesting it. That doesn't really happen in the U.S. context, as far as I know. If it does, please let me know, for people who do know. But I was thinking about it more in terms of the pandemic and the division between having to Zoom for Tarawih and what that did for people that wanted to break their fasts. So that's how I was thinking about it. But then for the non-Muslims, or for the bigots that I'm trying to think about, you know, there is a whole thing about wrapping the Quran in bacon and mailing it to places, like mailing it to the mosque locally, or mailing it to CARE headquarters, or mailing it to somebody you hate, or, you know, and so this whole idea of like the taste of the Quran in the Islamophobic register, or the anti-Muslim racist register, is the taste of bacon.
Mm.
right? And so we can think, we can kind of go through each of the senses and come up with a way of thinking about those things. Is like, you know, their sensory experience, the smell for many of them is of gasoline because they're burning it, right? They're going to burn the Quran. So there's like all these ways in which, how did they come at it? What is the sensory experience for them? Because obviously it does something for them, which is why they keep doing it, right? It means something. And then having that is, and of course, it's totally removed from the sensory experiences of Muslims. That structure has been abandoned, but I think that material will still come up into it in various ways. And I think that, you know, this is something, like all my work, I just see myself as like contributing in a small way into much bigger conversations. But this is an area, the sensory experience of texts. This is really something that needs a lot more research. So if people are also looking for dissertation projects, this is something that we really need a lot more study of.
Thank you. I think we can take about one more question, which is great because we only have one more left. This one comes from Allison, who we saw earlier this morning. She writes, "Thanks so much for this amazing talk. I was really curious about the heightened focus on visuality and lack of attention to orality that you spoke about with white American atheists' engagement with the Quran. I'm not sure I have a very specific question, but I wonder what you make of the aesthetic histories contributing to this."
Yeah, so because we don't have a lot of time, I won't go deeply into it, but I will just say that there is a whole colonial genealogy. And so here I'm thinking about Charles Hirschkin, who's talked a little bit about this too, about the eye and the idea of you know, what does it mean to, you know, perceive visually the other, or the others, in this case, the other's book. And so that is a genealogy that I think will be really important to connect to this, and also how the book comes in to represent the tradition, right? That also has a colonial genealogy, and the idea of reading, and the idea, I mean, you know, the tentative title I have for the book is the Quran a good book? You know, reading Muslims and the culture wars. Initially, I thought to do a deep historical dive and start, you know, much earlier, but I think actually this project has broken into two different books for me, which I can also talk about if you're interested. But that idea of visual consumption, right? That I can see it and that I can read it for myself and I can understand it and I can then make a value judgment. So one of the ways I'm coming at this, like, what's the material in which I'm talking about this? The list of celebrities who have claimed to read the Quran and then, like Burke, you know, take the posture of, and it's good because I read it. So that's like Madonna, Lindsay Lohan. I mean, there's just, it goes on and on and on. Like, you know what I mean? There's just, it's just like, it's almost comical how many celebrities have say this. You know, there's, if you Google Lindsay Lohan, there's actually a bunch of pictures of Lindsay Lohan walking around with her giant mushaf, right? So, you know, that's how I want to come at it. It's like, what is it with this idea? Like, why would anybody say, you know what, should I hate Muslims? Let's see what Lindsay Lohan thinks. I don't, you know, I mean, but that is kind of what the situation we're put in. And I have to say, I don't know how I'm going to work this in exactly, but there is a connection to Palestine. One of the things that, I'll just give an example. So I gave this, there was a talk here at Yale, I think probably 2 years ago, our Center for Study of Anti-Semitism, and someone presented Israel as a settler colonial, you know, they were talking about settler colonialism of Israel. And this was actually a Sikh scholar who was just going on to give a number of other cases and talk about Israel. And someone stood up in the audience, and the Zionist stood up in the audience and gave a long spiel, objected. So this is a scene that I think many of us are familiar with having witnessed. At the end of this tirade about how he felt so offended by this presentation in which Israel was characterized as a settler colonial state, which it of course is, he said, "By the way, I have read the Quran and I appreciated the book." You know, so to me, there's just so many things happening there in that, like, and of course I am going to talk about the anti-Semitism that's seen as being in the Quran, and that's like essential of to it. But, you know, this idea that this person who, you know, he can say all of these things, he can, you know, he's able to say essentially say all of these racist things in a tirade in an audience, and then at the very end be absolved by saying, but I've had this visual, isolated, individualist experience of reading this book that belongs to all of these people that I can, defend their, the destruction of them, the oppression of them. I can't even tolerate a critique of that oppression. That's all absolved by just saying, but I read a book, I read your book, and I thought it was fine. So I'm not. And that's where I was trying to get at when I was saying it's like the black friend, invoking the black friend in order to say something very racist. So I hope that gets at the question a little bit.
Sure. We still have just a few minutes left, so there's one new question and one comment, so I'm going to quickly address those. The first comment comes from Dr. Juliana Hammer, who says, "Salam, Zarina. I just wanted to thank you for this profound intervention in our conversations on Islam, race, and the Quran. I'm planning already to include the video of the talk into my courses. I also want to thank you for your generosity in engaging with the work of so many of us. It's a wonderful model for all of us. So thank you, Dr. Hammer, for that comment."
I just have to say, I really do wish I was there, because last time I was there, I actually interviewed Carl Ernst about the scandal around assigning Michael Sell's book at UNC in 2002 as a common first year reading. And I did that actually at Juliana's house, and she made me an amazing dinner, and I am missing that. So we're going to have to hang out to make up for this, Juliana.
And just if we can just quickly get through this last question, because I do want to ask it. I think it's Ellen McLarney asks, "I love the idea of talking about the five senses and the experience of the Quran. I'm teaching this week Quran recitation and the issue of the conceptual separation between music and recitation. Yet there are some amazing instances, for example, Amir Suleiman's Meccan openings, for example, of the Quran being integrated into music-like experiences or renditions of the Quran. Does your project cover this kind of approach to the Quran?"
Yes, thank you, Ellen. That's a great question, and I absolutely, I don't want a work to reproduce a kind of high art, low art thing. So I am looking at all different kinds of aesthetic representations of the Quran, or artistic representations of the Quran, including hip hop and rap, and I don't think I have the credibility to be considered a head, but I am a fan, and I want to write about a lot of this material, including Omar Ibn Saeed and many others. But I should say that, I think that like part of what I'm trying to capture is the pervasive presence of the Quran in American popular culture, and probably no other form is more important than music, actually. And so that I think it has to be part of the story. But also, I also want to say that this is what Ellen's getting at is an important question, because I think even in my first book, in which I write about Tajweed and the pedagogy around Tajweed, I talk about the musical qualities of the Quranic recitation. And Muslims will often always say in response to that, no, it's not musical, but that's my way of translating it for non-Muslim audiences. But there is, of course, an important, Muslims have a stake in an investment in making a really clear distinction between music and Quran or other things, you know what I mean? So that's a really, that is really important. And I think that's parts, I'm still figuring out how to bring that in. But that is, I mean, in other words, it's like, again, we could think about this in terms of translation. That is something that also gets left untranslated, because there isn't this, why Muslims would be invested in that boundary makes sense for us as religious studies professors or people who might be familiar with these communities, but for a reading public, they just wouldn't understand why, especially because music is so central to like American Christianity, for example. So this is something that I also need to tease out more and think through. And so I would love to hear how others are thinking through that. And so if you have suggestions of things to read about this, but I think that has to be part of the story.
Great. So we're going to have to put an end to this wonderful conversation here. Thank you so much, Dr. Graywal, for
Thanks so
everything.
Much, and I look forward to the presentation tomorrow. This was great. This is really great. I'm really happy to be with all of you.
We're glad to have you. Just for our audience, just a reminder, the first day is now wrapping up, and tomorrow at 11 a.m. resumes with panel number 2. Social conflict and resistance, and then there's panel number 3 following, which is histories of racialization. Again, we will begin at 11 a.m. on the dot, and you can access the panels via Zoom the same way you did today. If you have any issues, please reach out to us on our Gmail, and we'll quickly get to you. So yeah, we hope to see you there. We had a wonderful audience today, and we hope to see everyone again tomorrow. Take care, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody.